the whole like story of the pandemic shifted, and it was not about keeping the healthcare system in check, and it wasn't about like keeping people from dying. It was, after a while, it became about people shouldn't get COVID, and these Swedish scientists were like, "This is impossible."
Hey guys, R Olson here, and welcome back to the Science Centric podcast. A couple of quick reminders before we dive into this episode's content. For one, remember to like this video and to subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers on our channel, and every new subscriber helps us along the way, so thank you. The other thing is, if you really like what we do here, you can support us directly on Patreon. We have a couple of nice benefits over there, including early access to new episodes, ad-free episodes, and you can also participate in a monthly Q&A with me where you can suggest show ideas, guest ideas, and help shape the direction of the show. So check out the description or head over to sciencecentric.com/support for more info. Johan Anderberg is a Swedish journalist and writer who has been a regular contributor to a number of Swedish and international media outlets, including Fokus, Sydsvenskan, I'm probably not saying that right, and TheWall Street Journal. His new book is The Herd: How Sweden Chose Its Own Path Through the Worst Pandemic in 100 Years. So, Johan, welcome to the podcast. So great to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Cool. So your book is called The Herd, and having read it, I get the impression that when you're talking about the herd, you're not just talking about herd immunity, you're talking about the herd as in sort of herd mentality and people, going along with what other people think. Is that the case? And my other question about that is, what was the origin of this book? How did it come about? And when did you start writing it?
I started writing it just like a few weeks after the pandemic hit really hard in the US and in Europe. And it became pretty clear that Sweden chose its own path. And at that time, this concept of herd immunity was really prevalent. And you were totally right about the double meaning of the word, because that was one thing that was very clear early on, that from the Swedish vantage point, very much looked like the rest of the world was like thinking the same, that dissenting voices weren't really heard. You could definitely see hear dissenting voices if you looked really hard, but to my understanding, and to most Swedes were very surprised that so many prestigious media outlets were on the lockdown train, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of Swedes are very much into professional journalism or mainstream media, as some people call it. It's like, as a journalist, we in Sweden we've been raised with the New York Times and the Washington Post and BBC being the gold standard of journalism. So I thought it was kind of terrifying to see them not questioning the assumptions here.
Yeah. I think that, there was sort of a consensus in the U.S. media about, following what guidelines the experts put forth and such. And I think journalists here were probably a little bit, scared about putting out information that was wrong or contradicted the experts, and then, being responsible for deaths as well. It's a bit of a precautionary thing. So maybe I think a lot of people early on in the COVID pandemic followed the story with Sweden. I mean, I know I did. I was like, wow, this is a little bit unusual what they're choosing to do, the Swedish government in particular. But maybe you could just tell the audience what Sweden did that was different, just to kind of set up kind of how this unfolded. But what were the main things that were different compared to, say, let's just say the United States, because I think my audience would be most interested in that.
I think there are a number of things that are very different. Like, first of all, we didn't really have any lockdown, or we didn't have a lockdown at all. After about a year, or maybe 8 or 9 months, there were some, I would say, pretty harsh restrictions, but compared to other countries, they weren't that strict. And there weren't very many laws either. It was mostly like recommendations. And no one pretty much wore face masks at any point during the pandemic. I think the numbers was like I guess like 10% of people wore it during the subway rush hours, when it was actually recommended for a few months. So, and I mean, and there are lots of small things as well. Like, we haven't given the vaccine to kids under the age of 12, and probably won't do either. So basically, I think the main difference is that the Swedish authorities didn't really see the risks associated with having COVID as that high compared to the US, and weighed other risks when it came to lockdowns and also the vaccine, I guess. And so it was pretty much a totally different approach from early on. And even now, because all the laws are off the books, and like the pandemic is officially over since half a year.
Yeah. So let's see, how do I want to phrase this? I'm thinking back to like early on in the pandemic, like, March of 2020. And I, remember thinking, like, at that time, like, I was really advocating that schools shut down because we didn't know what was happening. We didn't know how serious this was. And I remember when the schools actually finally shut down, I was like, okay, now people are taking this very seriously, because it's like, when schools shut down, that has all these like ripple on domino effect through the society. Like, parents can't work, obviously that's a huge thing. Like, we have to find alternative daycare and that sort of stuff. So what I'm curious about is that, and you detail this in the book, although you're getting more into the science, but like this group of Swedish epidemiologists, I mean, how did they know? How did they know what they were doing was right? Or did they just, like, was it just kind of faith? Or, I mean, it takes a lot of strength of will to kind of oppose everything that's going on around you. So is it just come down to personality, or, what was the difference there?
I think personality is an important part of it. When Anders Tegnell, who was the man in charge, when he was hired to the Public Health Authority the first time, his mentor really liked that he was so unfazed, and so that he didn't really care about what people thought of him, and that he was not like a political human being at all. And I guess a lot of other scientists who would have just felt the need to do what everyone else did. And in Denmark and Norway, the scientists there kind of wanted to do the Swedish path, but they were overrun by their politicians, and they didn't really make a big fuss about it in the media or anything. So I guess the personality is one part, but they also, like, judging from all these emails I've read between these scientists, it's pretty obvious that they figured out early on that this wasn't as deadly as the rest of the world thought. Once they had this path, there was a really influential report from Imperial College in London, and when you take those numbers and recalibrate them for Sweden, we were supposed to have somewhere around 100,000 deaths in 3 months in 2020, and the actual result came to 6,000. So it was pretty obvious that all these projections were overblown. And yeah. But then, you know, the whole like story of the pandemic shifted, and it was not about keeping the healthcare system in check, and it wasn't about like keeping people from dying. It was, after a while, it became about people shouldn't get COVID, and these Swedish scientists were like, "This is impossible. There's no way we can stop people."
So their thinking was that if you let enough people get infected, that it would create this kind of herd immunity effect. That, you know, eventually, like, I think in the book you said at some point somebody calculated like 40% of the population would have some kind of exposure, and that would kind of be the end of the pandemic, right?
Yeah, and they were kind of wrong about that. It took a lot more people to. But what did happen was that Stockholm was really hard hit the first time around, and then the numbers were much lower the second time around. So what happened was that the pandemic shifted to other parts of Sweden. So there was definitely an immunity that protected the Swedish population after a while.
Mm-hmm,
so, but they were like a little bit too optimistic about when this herd immunity would enter, so to speak. And then the vaccine came, and that sort of changed the whole calculation.
Yeah. And so that's sort of the end of your book, right? Or the main narrative of your book is, okay, the vaccine comes along, and that's sort of the end of this experiment.
Yeah.
But do we know that, like, you know, from that, I mean, was it a whole year that we basically went without a vaccine? I mean, I think it was the better part of a year.
Yeah, I mean, the vaccine came on November 9th, I think, in the UK. That was like the first shot, but we didn't like get any doses until for real until the spring of 2021. So that's the time when like pretty much everyone started getting it.
Yeah.
So
is there evidence that this strategy of just letting the virus, letting COVID sort of course through the population, that was actually, or not, I shouldn't say course through the population, but that there was sort of this trying to have a more measured release of the virus through the population, that was actually effective?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the excess deaths and the deaths by COVID, Sweden comes out really well. Almost like, or actually in all ways of counting, Sweden is among the lowest in Europe and in the world. There was actually a WHO report. It came out today, I think, and Sweden, and that corroborates that view as well. That other countries that locked down were much harder hit, and Germany wasn't that hard hit in the beginning. And in Sweden, all these newspapers who were kind of pro lockdown, they wrote all these stories about Germany doing the right thing, and now Germany is worse off than Sweden, according to this. And like they've been masking kids and they shut schools on and off. So, I mean, I think the story here isn't as so much Sweden as the rest of the world, just having this weird policy experiment that didn't succeed in any way.
It seems like, you know, you have all these different countries, and in the US, like, you know, we're such a big country, we have all these states that did different interventions to try to stop or mitigate the effects of the virus. But it seems like in the end, none of it really worked that well. And, you know, and then what do you look at? I guess you look at, you know, how the differential and how the economies were affected, and was the huge cost of these lockdowns and wearing masks and shutting things down, was that was that, justified? Did it actually have an impact? So, I mean, do we know that in terms of Sweden? I mean, did Sweden come out of the pandemic in a better financial shape than other countries, like other Nordic countries in particular? Because that's probably a good way to compare, is to look at Denmark and Norway. And
I think all the Scandinavian countries came out really well, judging by economic standards. But I don't know if it's such a good way of measuring the toll of the pandemic, since, like, just to translate this to the US, like, say you have like a state that is very export oriented, then what you do in that state doesn't really matter for the economy. It's like who buys our stuff, and Sweden has also a very export oriented economy. So like, if people don't buy like our cars or our Spotify services or whatever, then the economy will do bad. And I guess tourist countries would have been really hard hit as well. So
yeah.
And like, I guess Norway was like, had a pretty good economy throughout, but I mean, their economy is like based on oil, so their economy is a proxy of the oil price. So I think the economy angle has always been a little bit stupid in my ears, actually.
So what do you think's like a better measure of, cost benefit?
I mean, I would like to read a study of like missed school days, how, I mean, public health in general, like teen depression. I guess the true cost will be seen like many years from now.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to like really hard lockdown countries and states.
Yeah. I think. I just read something this morning that someone looked at educational attainment in math in particular, that kids who were in remote learning did like 30% worse than kids that were still doing in-person school. They all did worse because, they weren't getting the same education that they would have gotten had there not been a pandemic. But the remote learning was really bad in that sense. And I'm guessing the other,
Yeah, and it's especially bad for disadvantaged kids.
Yes, right.
I mean, I'm a writer, and I can stay at home with my kids and teach them. If we're like, but if your parents work at McDonald's and or like at Amazon, I mean, and that's actually really interesting, because in Sweden there was a left-wing government throughout this pandemic, and it was actually seen as kind of a left-wing thing to not lock down, because it would have been so much worse for. But in the US, it was like the opposite, and to me that doesn't make sense at all, because I mean, if we had locked down, I would have done like all rich Swedes. I would just go to like the mountain cabin and go skiing all day, and like teach my kids English in the afternoon. But I mean, if you're poor, you can't do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. Just kids who had parents who needed to go off to some kind of service job or something like that were really in a lot of trouble. I mean, we had my wife and I, we have, 2 young kids, and we were able to do that as well. We have jobs that were flexible to be able to stay at home. Not to say it didn't impact, it wasn't an impact, but, probably less so than someone, making ends meet in a service type job.
Were they happy to go back to school? It's
Oh yeah. It was well, I have one that's in daycare, not in school, but my older son was so happy to be going back, and just hated remote school. It was just, liked it at first, but then when you're doing that for 9 months, it's pretty tough. And With the younger kid, I think, he was a toddler through it till preschool age now. And I do think it probably did have some impact on his language development. I think he's a little bit behind there. Just not being around other kids that, because we pulled him out of daycare, just not being around other kids, because I think there's some peer pressure with language development that when they're around kids that maybe are advancing a little bit faster, that they want to catch up. But when you're not around other kids that are kind of closer to your age, then you follow. I mean, I don't have studies to prove that, but that's my thinking about it.
Yeah, but I think language is very associated with like your peers, because I have a very thick southern Swedish accent, but my kids have like they speak like they're friends. I mean, they don't care about the way I speak. That's like not true.
I think there's some good evidence for that in terms of of kids being very influenced by their peers. And I don't know specifically about language, but I know about other things. That's true. So I don't know why language would be any different. So your book was like really, you really had an intimate view of sort of what was going on during this, early pandemic. And it almost reads as like almost like a thriller kind of, you're like sitting at the meeting with all of these people. How did you get access to all of this information, in particular their emails? I mean, you had all these email exchanges and everything. Is that public record, or how did you?
Yeah, public.
Oh, okay.
Sweden has like very liberal Freedom of Information Act, so that's one reason that I started writing this book, because I knew there was going to be some really juicy stuff in there, and I knew it also would take like a book project to go through it, because it was like a total like 10,000 emails or something like that. So it took a couple of months to go through it all, and so they were like very open. And the funny thing is that people, like, if you work at like in the government offices in Sweden and you've been in touch with the media, then you know you're not supposed to write this kind of stuff in an email. But these people, like, no one had cared about these people.
Right.
So they had like no idea that someone would one day write a book about them.
Now, did you also interview some of these people, like what Anders Tegnell? That's the state epidemiologist for Sweden, and then there's this whole cast of characters. Did you get to talk to them in person as well?
Yeah, like the funny thing was that like a lot of people were like really open. Probably Anders Tegnell the least, but he did this press conference every day. So if you just stood there and stood in line for like an hour, then you could like ask 5 or 10 questions. So it was kind of funny. Like everyone asked questions about like the pandemic, what happened that day, like whether or not Denmark would close its borders and blah blah blah. But I always asked something about something that had happened like in the 70s or 80s. I had read like all these books and all these like studies, and like, do you still believe what you wrote in the Lancet article in 1988? And so it was kind of real weird. It felt like I lived in like a parallel universe for
One thing that struck me also is just that it seemed like the Swedish government, for at least for that first year of the pandemic, just sort of handed the reins over to Anders Tegnell. And that was pretty stark contrast to what was happening in the U.S. with Trump. And I mean, is that seem typical for the Swedish people, that they have that much trust in scientists? I feel like the U.S. there's at least amongst the conservatives in our country, they're very skeptical of scientists and scientific experts.
I mean, Swedes, I guess, are like pretty trusting of scientists. Like when normally 97% of all kids take all their shots.
Yeah.
Or their parents like give them their shots. And but when it comes to politicians, that's like really interesting because we have a habit of not electing very charismatic politicians. So most of them are pretty low key compared to American politicians, and especially Stefan Löfven, who was the prime minister at that time. Because the Labour Party had this, they were like in a crisis, and pretty much no one wanted the spot as the leader of that party. So he had to be convinced, and even though he was the prime minister for like 8 years, he never seemed to enjoy it at all. Felt like he always wanted to quit. So it would have been very out of character of him to take charge. So that's definitely a little part of the puzzle. Because if it had been like a more, like another kind of politician, then maybe a more of a populist politician probably would have taken the reins a little bit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it would have been for him for constitutional reasons, because there are some really strong sentences in the Constitution that bars many of those things that the rest of the world did. And I'm kind of surprised that the U.S. Constitution allowed it. I'm not an expert on the U.S. Constitution, but to me it sounded really that politicians have the ability to lock down cities and states like that.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I'm not a legal expert either, but I think, I mean, I do have some interest in civil liberties. I think generally speaking, there's the executive, whether you're talking about it, the national, the state, or the city level, usually has some kind of emergency powers that they can enact, lockdowns or things to protect the public health. So I think that's where that came from. But in fact, a lot of those lockdowns and executive orders, as they would call them, have been challenged in court and and they've usually been struck down by the courts because they're really supposed to be for a limited amount of time when you need an executive who can just get things done quickly. But if there's going to be a law that's going to persist, then it's supposed to go through the legislature. So, in fact, a lot of those things have been, and that actually happened where I'm at in New York. They struck down the governor's mandate about masks as unconstitutional.
Okay. Yeah, because we have this debate now in Sweden, like after the pandemic. Because everyone found out that there were no emergency powers in the Constitution. And it has to be like a war for those to be valid. So there's this debate about whether or not we should have those. And I think this pandemic shows that it's pretty good to not have them.
Well, there's definitely a thing that, having studied that a little bit in the U.S. with the president, that once you grant an executive powers, they're very unwilling to give them up. Even their successor is unwilling to give up those powers, because of course they think, well, I'm going to do something great with them. That's the old story of, increasing. So in the U.S., like the president has become increasingly powerful. There was always supposed to be a checks and balances against that, but. So I think that's smart. I mean, I think that's right. And I don't know if that's, we have.
I think it's very difficult for politicians and authorities to create like the best public health scenario in situations like this too. Because what you saw in a lot of U.S. states actually, and in England, was that people started like locking down or like hunkering down even before they were forced to. So that just shows that people are pretty rational when it comes to their public health, and that it might be better to just to let people have that power to themselves. Because if you just make the thought experiment that you have like a virus that has like a 10% mortality, I mean, you probably don't need a law to keep people at home.
Right.
So,
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that was true, at least for me personally. I mean, even before school shut down, I had kept my son back from school because I didn't, I was being, you know, I was having the phrase we heard a lot was abundance of caution. I was like, I don't know what's going on, but I think at some point, everyone was looking at Italy and going, wow, this is terrible. What's happening. There's really high case fatality rate. And, but,
Yeah.
people that I say follow on Twitter, smart people. One of them's his name is Mark Chengizi. He's actually been on this podcast. He's works in like neuroscience, but he's smart guy, background in physics, and he was saying early on, oh, this is overblown, and really through the whole pandemic, he's saying this is overblown. This is calling it social contagion and stuff like that. And I didn't know what to make of that, but over time, he's been proven correct. So, is it that he knew all along, or or is it just there was a 50 chance that he was right and he happened to, that just sort of bear it out over time? That's what I kind of wonder about. I wonder about with these Swedish epidemiologists. It's just like, well, they took a stance, which was brave, but what if they'd been wrong?
They were a little bit wrong, to be honest, because they
Yeah.
definitely underestimated the risks, but only by a factor of like two. Whereas the rest of the world probably overestimated by a factor of 10, something like that. So,
Yeah.
according to these predictions. So, they were like closer to the truth. But you're right, it could have, if it had gone like the other way, they would have, but I guess then my book would have been like even more interesting.
Yes, it would have been a story of failure.
And that would have been the story of the century in Sweden. Like how they just like didn't do anything when like 100,000 people died. And
Yeah.
that's a lot by Swedish standards because we're only 10 million people here. And I know that these numbers like 6,000 here. It sounds very little, but there are only 10 million of us, so you have to like scale that up by a factor of 30
Yeah.
for US. Yeah,
Well, that's one thing I mean, that's kind of my takeaway from this pandemic. It just seems like there's so much variability in where you live, how old you are, maybe your ethnicity, like all of these risk factors, and everyone has to evaluate their own risk, and we're all terrible at it. Like we know this. We know people are terrible at estimating their own risk. Everybody thinks it's more dangerous to fly in airplanes, for example, than to drive, when it's exactly the opposite, right?
yeah. And the media has been really bad when it comes to explaining the risks involved here. Because
Yeah.
when you ask Americans and British people like what their own risk is, it's like way overblown, and they like especially young people overestimate their risk by a lot,
Hmm.
and they underestimate the risk of old people because it is really dangerous for old people.
Yes, right.
But
And those
to
with like pre-existing conditions too that are, you know,
yeah,
already
and
frail.
but there was this study being made during the first year of the pandemic when about they asked people in Europe and in the US about how many people that they thought had died, and in Britain, a third of the people thought that this as many people as lived in Wales had died. So uh,
Which
I
is
think
like
in the
how many
US,
people? How many people is
I, I, think,
that?
I think it's like 5 or 6 million or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
And so in most countries they had overestimated the deaths hundredfold or more.
Yeah.
So that just shows you what a weird perspective people had
Yeah.
on the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think in the U.S. they predicted it could be millions. So one thing that was really interesting about your book is like, okay, we have this peek inside the worlds of, state epidemiologists and their
Yeah,
adjacent, peers, but also it's really kind of a look inside of epidemiology as a whole, and it seems like there's only maybe a couple handfuls of these people that are really not making policy, but putting out papers and things that inform the policy. So early on, so it seemed like all these people kind of know each other. So what is the connection with Sweden in terms of like the rest of the world's epidemiology or public health community? I mean, they're fairly prominent compared to than what you might think for a country of 10 million people.
Yeah, that was also a coincidence, because the guy who hired Anders Tegnell, his name is Johan Giesecke, and he had been like somewhat of a big guy in this field, and he sort of was the one that made the European CDC be stationed in Stockholm. So all these like scientists were based in Stockholm, and he was the first head scientist of the European CDC. So he had like a lot of power in that world, and he knew like all these people in England who made these predictions. And I mean, he's pretty blunt about what he thinks about them. He thinks they're like hacks, pretty much. So that was also kind of lucky that just these few people had that insight into this college that made this kind of terrible report, one has to say. And I mean, people get it wrong all the time, but to be that wrong and to be that influential is a really bad combination.
Yeah, and to bring it back to the media as well, of course, like let's say you put out a prediction about, you put out a model and you say, well, this is the range of values. Let's say it's 100,000 or 400,000 can die. Of course, they're going to latch on to 400,000, that number or whatever,
Yeah.
So I think the media has a lot of responsibility or culpability, I should say, in this as well, in that just always latching on to that most like dramatic, number, when in fact, I don't know. Yeah. I didn't actually I never looked at that paper, but that we're referring to Neil Ferguson at Imperial College London, and early on in the epidemic, he made these predictions about how many people would die and was completely proven wrong. So I guess at the, having studied this for a while, how bad was it really? I mean, how many people how many people died as a results of COVID?
I mean, it was very bad. It was it's probably the worst pandemic in 100 years. And I've seen like some people say that it was on par with the Spanish flu, but that's completely not correct. The Spanish flu was many times worse. So that's also one of these things that is difficult to talk about when it comes to risks. I mean, even though it's the worst thing in 100 years, most people probably have been at higher risk of some other things in their lives. And I know that there was a study in Stanford that tried to compare it to driving a car X miles. And I mean, I think that's a really good way of framing it to people. And of course, if you're old, it might be as driving a car, just 1,000 miles. But for young people, you have to drive a whole lot.
I haven't seen that. Yeah, I haven't seen that comparison. That's kind of an interesting one.
It's John Ioannidis.
At Stanford, yeah. And he was a vocal kind of critic of some of the earlier estimates, I believe. Yeah. About prevalence and like infection fatality rate, case fatality rate. He said it was way too high.
Yeah, and that's all, like he was one of the reasons why I was also interested in this like contrarian take, because I kind of knew of him before because a lot of doctor friends of mine, like some statistician friends of mine, they had talked about him for a while, and so he was kind of a known quantity, and it's kind of interesting to see all these like pretty prominent scientists that have like other views, and suddenly you don't see them very much in the media. So if you have like a prior understanding of some scientific things, then it's like easier to have your own opinion, I think.
So one thing I just thought of is, if vaccines hadn't come along in, in Sweden and actually in the US too, in spring of 2021, what do you think would have happened in Sweden in terms of the policies and such? Would this experiment have continued, or was it already kind of coming to an end in terms of shutting things down, shutting down schools, wearing masks, those sorts of things?
I mean, I think it would have continued because I mean it is a little bit what happened. I took part in this seminar with some like epidemiologists the other week, and then one of the people in charge, she's not in my book because she has been just like taken over, and she said that it wasn't so much the vaccines, but the Omicron wave that really killed the pandemic. So something like that would have happened, and the pandemic would have been over, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was an interesting insight because I've never really heard anyone say that before. But it was actually a little bit the natural immunity that killed the pandemic.
Right. So she's saying, and what's her name? Do you know? Do you remember?
Quarantine Mark Bissell, yeah.
Okay. So the idea would be that because Omicron is more contagious, but less, has like, is less severe, that people would have gained immunity anyways over time.
Yeah, and also that
without a big death toll.
Yeah, and also that people got it even though they had been vaccinated.
Right.
So, like actually, the window where the vaccine was like really powerful was pretty short in Sweden, or a year. So, but also, I think I would have thought that the vaccine would be more powerful because the early studies indicated that it was like super efficient, whereas it was more like a normal flu vaccine maybe. So it definitely played a huge part. But to answer your question, I think that is what would have happened. That there would have been like a wave, and then another wave, and then another wave. And I guess the rest of the world would have stopped locking down because I don't know. Would they have continued for like 5 or 6 years? It's pretty unlikely, I think.
Yeah.
Or maybe China is still doing it. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think they've had some recent lockdowns where they just like shut down the whole city. Yeah. One thing that I've been thinking about is, have we actually like learned anything from these past couple of years? If another pandemic came along, which it probably will, from everything I understand about, origins of these viruses. I mean, do you think that we will be any better prepared? Do we actually learn anything about what we should do and not do? Because I think when I talk to people in the US, they tend to think that the measures that we took were effective and did something to kind of prevent deaths. And I at this point, I'm not clear about that at all. I think it's questionable.
I think you're totally right that it's very questionable that they had any effect, and I think everyone will understand that eventually. Because I think we have to dial down the conflict a little bit, and then there will be like a new wave of journalists, because there are many journalists who haven't touched the subject, and those are the people that have to write like the American book about this, and go through what really happened. And I think my book is like a start that it's kind of weird how Sweden was portrayed as this reckless nation, and there are like all these stories about how many people that actually died in Sweden, and now after 2 years we actually have fewer deaths, and that's a very good control group, I think, if you want to start digging deeper into what actually happened here.
Yeah.
And I think this is a tale about a group thing more than like anything I've ever seen in my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing that you highlighted in the book and that I've definitely noticed is that, and a reason that I haven't really, I mean, I could have done a bunch of podcast episodes on COVID and I just kind of avoided it, it just became so politicized in the United States about, what you should do or not do. And it really became conservatives against liberals in terms of, interventions and things like that. So,
but I think
my concern is just that if there was another pandemic, we'd just be back on the lines of, the political divide in terms of, oh, do this, don't do that. So I just hope that, maybe we can learn something from Sweden in terms of how to take a more rational scientific approach to it. But I don't know about, I think Sweden maybe is better that way than the US. I think the US is a little bit, I don't know. It's just more polarized, I think. I don't know. I don't know Sweden's political system very well, or parties or anything like that. But
I mean, I'm pretty hopeful about the US. It always turns out pretty well in the end, I think. And I think here it's going to be the same thing, that, like, when you think about other really politicized issues, like say like the Iraq War, at least here in Sweden, I think in the US too, like people can admit that they were wrong about this and wrong about that, and we've had other things in Sweden, like whether or not to join the euro, and people have been pretty open about that. Yeah, I was wrong about that, even though it was very, very harsh at the time. And I think that will happen too with COVID, that people will just be a little bit more chill about reading the data and admitting that they were wrong. I mean, you seem to have made that journey yourself. You were like very pro lockdown, so it only took you a year.
Yeah, that's a good point. I definitely is the kind of person that would always, I mean, I've always had a huge amount of respect for example, for the CDC, and I always thought of them as sort of an apolitical, neutral, entity with very high standards for evidence and things like that. But I think I'm more of the I've come around to this idea that at least with this pandemic, it's been more of a political decisions are being made more by political considerations than scientific ones.
Yeah, but
and
I think it's always like that in science, that because they are just like any kind of jobs. They have like office politics, people you want to be friends with and people you want to avoid, and like, I mean, they're not insulated from that kind of human behavior.
Yeah, I do think that the CDC currently has it right in that they issue these guidelines that are on a by like per county level in the US. So they say, like, they have different levels of intervention they recommend for how many cases are in your, the case, what would you call that? The prevalence of new cases or something like that. They're, for example, if it's very low number of new cases, then they're not recommending masks. If it's very high, then they'd say, like, yes, let's do masks because we know that they're not super effective, but we'll do any intervention to keep people out of hospitals at this point because,
but I wonder about these, like, how sure can you be that those numbers are accurate? Isn't it like very based on how many people that actually go test themselves, and can you really be sure that it's much worse in one county than another? Because people have like suggested these things in Sweden too, but they never it never happened. So that's why I wonder that.
I mean, that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know. I would have to look and see how they're determining that. So you're bringing up the point that it could be, you know, there could be some self-selection going on where people,
Yeah.
or selection bias, where people are going, you know, they're counting cases of people that are going that are sick. So I hope that they're doing some kind of randomized testing. You know, they're just picking a random sample of people and determining it that way. But I don't know. I don't know for sure. What I do think is right is that they're looking at it by area on a pretty granular level and not just making these blanket recommendations for like a whole state. So that's a bit better, but and then they've pretty much ditched the mask requirement. But as we mentioned, as we talked about before we started recording, in New York City only, not even New York State, they still have this mask requirement for 2 to 4 year olds, which makes no sense because they've been the sort of the group at least risk for any kind of severe COVID complications. So it's very bizarre.
It is very disheartening to see those images from the US with kids in classrooms wearing masks. I really hope that they reevaluate those things pretty fast.
Yeah, me too. But I think that's another situation where you go, you know, you come around to this idea that this a lot of this is driven by politics and politicians wanting to look like they're doing something. And when you look at the actual science, you just go, this doesn't make sense. This intervention doesn't make any sense. So why do we still have it? And now, you know, bringing it back to your book, we're talking about following the herd or not. The herd is actually ditching masks at this point. And so our mayor in New York City, Eric Adams, is not following the herd and doing something that no one else is doing. So I don't know, maybe he'll be proven right at some point, but I don't think so. I don't think the science is there.
Why is New York taking such like its own path here?
I think part of it, and I've talked about this a bit with my wife, but you know, we were one of the areas in the U.S. that was hit pretty hard initially, and New York is very unusual in the United States in terms of density, population density, and we have a lot of people here who are, you know, have a lot of health issues that are kind of living in marginalized communities. So we got hit pretty hard, and so I think that's made people very cautious about, you know, removing restrictions. But you know, that mask mandate for 2 to 4 year olds I'm talking about came about in December of 2021. I mean, this was not March of 2020. It was like the end of 2021. So it's very it's the whole thing's very bizarre. Anyways, I could go on about that for an hour, but that's a good place to wrap up. And so, Johan, is there where's the best place for people to find you online? And let's start with that.
My Twitter is at Johan Anderberg. That's one word.
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably the best way.
Great. We'll add a link to that so people can find you. And then when is the Herd book coming out in the U.S.? Or is it out already? I was a little confused about that.
In 2 weeks throughout the U.S. But I'm pretty sure you can read it on Kindle already because it's out in like Australia and the UK. So you can, if you have that, you can read it, and probably other similar services that I don't know about.
Yeah, I looked on Amazon and I was like, oh, you can buy this today if you want. So If people are interested, anybody who's interested in epidemiology that wants, like I said, an inside peek into this world of epidemiology during this global pandemic, it's a really great read, and really learned a lot. So thanks for writing it. And I think we'll end there.
Good talk. It was fun. Thanks for having me.